Hello, I am Baal Kadmon, and I'd like to thank you for watching and or listening to this video. I hope everyone's doing well. I've been very busy. I just released a program on the Jinn, an 86 video program that has gotten a lot of great feedback. And if you haven't enrolled in it, you can go to occultcourses.com/Jinn and you can enroll there. I'm also working on two programs now, one on the Watchers, which is already massive, and one actually on the Tibetan Book of the Dead. Someone had asked me to go into depth about it, and I have studied that text since the 90s, and Tibetan Buddhism in general, which happens to be one of the topics that I truly love. I actually have two books sort of on the topic that not many people know about. But anyway, I'm not going to discuss that now. So as some of you know, I've had a struggled for quite a few months with vestibular neuritis. And, during that time, I sort of went into myself, like I'm the type of person, I'm already naturally introverted as it is. But when I'm wounded in some way, I sort of go into a cave and sort of lick my wounds. And this was a very extended wound licking, so to speak. So now I sort of got used to being in this cave. So I've been really bad about staying in touch with friends and family, but I'm trying to get out there, trying to move past that. So if I owe you messages, I know I said in the last video, I'll get back to you. I will. I just need a little bit more wiggle room here as I get out of what was probably one of the worst years of my life. If it wasn't for these projects, I don't know what would have become of me. Let's put it that way. So this video and the two to follow are about G.I. Gurdjieff. Now, interestingly enough, I have been very influenced by his work, but you would never know it because I don't really cover his work a lot. But the reason why I'm doing this series of videos, I don't have any projects with him or anything like that unless you want me to have one. But I had an email last week sometime, someone who had asked me about his philosophies and what I thought about them. And I started the email and then I emailed them back saying, listen, would you rather a video? That I could sort of publish and get a little bit deeper instead of just writing 20-page email. And he was very open to that. So this is a product of the next 3 videos are a product of that question. And I thank him for bringing this topic up. And also it seems that I've gotten very good feedback about podcasts that I issue in a series, right? I only did one recently, on the Pardes, the biblical interpretation, and people really seem to like that series. So I might do more of these types of series, and so this will be one of them. So G.I. Gurdjieff, I was very much exposed to his work in the late 80s and early 90s, and during that time, that's when I was really jumping into, New Thought and Theosophy and reading books, by people like, Elizabeth Clare Prophet and all of these authors, even though I can't say that they're necessarily all related to each other, but it was during that time where I was very much exposed to him. And at the time, when I was reading his book and a lot of the work through his student, P.D. Ouspensky, I didn't understand it, right? It was a little bit too dense for me at the time, but then because I was just not mentally mature enough. And, later in time, obviously I came back to it and then I finally understood it. And I resonate very strongly with a lot of his work. Obviously, some of it, not so much, but a lot of it I do enjoy. So in this video, I'm going to discuss just very briefly about him and then a few of his broader concepts. And as you know, and if you've taken any of my programs at occultcourses.com, you notice that I sort of start broad. And then as videos progress, I get deeper and more granular. So let's start from the very basics here. Who was G.I. Gurdjieff? And G.I. just stands for George Ivanovich. And he was just a remarkable teacher, right? And his ideas, they influence us even today. He was born in Armenia, which was then part of the Russian Caucasus. And so his background was very diverse. His father was a poet who would tell like all of these ancient tales. I guess you could say he was sort of like a bard. But it was his family friend, who was an Orthodox priest, that really sparked his interest in spirituality. And so as a young man, Gurdjieff embarked on really extraordinary journeys all across Central Asia, the Middle East, North Africa. And for 2 decades or so, he sought, all the wisdom that he could find from these various traditions, from Buddhism to Hinduism, Sufism, and Christian mysticism, just to name a few. And he documented these travels in his book, which is sort of semi-autobiographical, called Meetings with Remarkable Men. And he sort of described these people as sort of seekers of the truth. Now, what made him so unique was his ability to synthesize Eastern and Western spiritual traditions into a system for modern living. Now, his dates are 1866 to 1949. In 1912, he began teaching in Moscow. And one of his students, like I sort of mentioned a little bit earlier, was P.D. Ouspensky, who was later to document most of his teachings, Gurdjieff's teachings. And following the Russian Revolution, Gurdjieff led his students or followers, I guess you could say, through a very dangerous escape from Russia, and eventually ended up in Paris in 1992, where he formed the Institute for the Harmonious Development of Man. Now, at that institute, Gurdjieff, he created an environment where the students engaged in interesting things, like music, body movement, because he had this belief that moving your body was very crucial. And I don't mean like just for exercise, but spiritually. So he encouraged crafts and, I guess you could say, intensive self-observation. And it was all designed to awaken the higher consciousness in a person, but within the context of their daily life, their average daily life. So let's now deal with some of his broader concepts. Now, the name of his, I guess you could say, his overarching way of philosophy, I guess a way of living, was called the Fourth Way. Now, traditional spiritual paths, Gurdjieff observed, typically required separation from the world, right? You had to retreat to a monastery, an ashram, or the desert. And through his studies, he identified 3 of these approaches to higher development that people seem to be focused on, right? So we have the way of the fakir, which this path focuses on conquering the physical body through various ascetic practices, bodily endurance, and feats of will, right? So you've probably read, if you've read any books on spiritual mystics and ascetics of various different religions, you notice that they live ascetic practices, they take bodily mortifications, and all these feats that the normal person would just collapse after a day. So that is essentially the way of the fakir. And then you have the way of the monk, and this path really cultivates the emotional realms, like through devotion, so faith and prayer, surrender to God, and things of that nature. And while developing this sort of emotional intelligence, monks would neglect other aspects of their life, right? Like the intellectual understanding and physical mastery, which of course is the way, the physical mastery is the way of the fakir. And then the way of the yogi And this path, according to Gurdjieff, was the path of intellectual development through the study of sacred texts and mental disciplines, meditation, and things like that. So while yogis achieved these intellectual insights and mental control, they lacked the emotional and physical spheres. So you see what I'm saying? It's like each of these traditions seem to focus on a different path. Some focused on the way of the fakir, or the body, right? Some focus on the way of the monk, which was sort of emotional realm, and then some of the way of the yogi, which is the intellectual realm. So he was like, each of these paths required very specific conditions. And like I said earlier, there were isolation from life, essentially. And sometimes it could take, decades to perfect these, and you don't really ever perfect them. So he didn't really like this way of being, right? So he created a revolutionary system that he called the fourth way. And this is designed for people to immerse in contemporary life and bring the way of the fakir, the way of the monk, and the way of the yogi sort of together. So sort of to bring them into one unified system. So unlike the others, the fourth way does not require you to retire into the desert or to, do anything that is sort of extreme. So rather than withdrawing from life's challenges, the fourth way practitioners used everyday experiences as a means for transformation. So in essence, life becomes like a laboratory of self-observation and self-transformation. And his students would refer to this as the work. And that's a great word for it. So here are the key principles that sort of distinguish the fourth way from other systems. There's no permanent institutions. There's no the fourth way doesn't manifest through a specific teacher, okay? Verification through experience. Nothing is accepted on faith. You verify based on your observation and whether it can work in life, right? Can this actually be done in your actual life and not require withdrawal? So that is very important. Now, let's look at the concept sort of like of waking up. There's a saying that man lives his life in sleep, and in sleep he dies. Now, this assessment is really the cornerstone of Gurdjieff's teachings. What appears to be normal waking consciousness, he asserted, is actually sort of a form of hypnotic trance, right? It's a waking sleep. And it's true. I mean, we live every day in our sort of default state. So he says, and he's challenging this, right, that we need to open our eyes. We have to wake up. So he invites us to sort of question the assumptions that we have carefully through self-observation. So when we pay close attention to our state throughout the day, we might notice things like our attention constantly shifts from present moment to memories to internal dialogues. When we perform tasks like driving or typing, notice that we're without conscious awareness of the process, right? I don't really drive myself, but I see people, they're zoned out, they're just doing their thing. That is sort of an unconscious awareness, right? We also react to situations with a very predictable emotional pattern. We get triggered, right? And he's saying that that's part of being sort of waking sleep. We repeatedly make the same mistakes and break the same resolutions and all of this from day to day. So what this points to is Gurdjieff, what he called relative consciousness. So it's a partial, intermittent awareness that's very different from being truly awake. Now, the tragedy of this situation is that we don't recognize it. Because we mistake our fragmented awareness for full consciousness, and all of our mechanical reactions as being free choice, but in fact, they're the illusion of consciousness. It's the illusion of free will. You see, we're actually doing this almost completely on autopilot. Now, Gurdjieff said, as dire as that sounds, awakening is possible. The entire aim of his system is to sort of help people experience moments of consciousness, of true consciousness. So what he called self-consciousness and objective consciousness. And his system was meant for that. So these awakened states that he's talking about aren't necessarily mystical, right? They're not mystical abstractions, but they're actual concrete shifts in his perception in general, and your presence. So such moments might be brief. We might have moments where we're completely present in the moment. We experience direct contact with reality, unmediated by labels and judgments and associations. And so I've experienced that. I'm sure many of you have also experienced that in your practices, in your spiritual practices, but they are brief, and sometimes they are brief at first, and sometimes they're triggered by different things like danger, unusual circumstances, beauty, and those are sort of out of your control. They sort of snapped you awake, but you can, with intentional practice, become more awake more frequently and more sustainably. Now, how does one sort of begin to awaken from this sleep? Now, I'm going to get into more in depth about that in the third video, but I'll just give you an overview. So how do we get up from that? How do we wake up from that? And really, the concept is self-remembering, okay? And so in ordinary attention, consciousness is one-pointed. We focus either on external objects or internal processes, but rarely simultaneously on both, right? So self-remembering introduces a very radical change. It's essentially divided attention. So I guess you could say in this state, you sort of maintain an awareness of yourself as a presence, but also simultaneously engaging with your environment. So this creates sort of this conscious, I guess the right word would be duality. So it's like, I am here, experiencing this. You see, so that transforms both your relationship to yourself, but also to whatever you're experiencing. So like, for example, while walking, feeling the sensation of your body in motion, while also taking in your surroundings. During a conversation, right? Maintaining awareness of your posture, your breathing, and your internal sort of reactions, but still listening intently to the other person. And I guess more importantly, for a lot of us in our states of emotion, in moments of emotion, a high emotion, we can experience the feeling fully, but also simultaneously witnessing it from a place of, I guess you could say, presence. So when you do this, the practice creates what Gurdjieff called sort of the deputy steward, which is an observing part that remains steady even when things are changing around you. So just to be clear, though, self-remembering is not thinking about yourself or analyzing your behavior. It's not introspection or self-consciousness in the way we're used to using it, but rather it's a direct sensation of one's own presence. So it's an immediate experience of I am alongside whatever else is happening. So it's very interesting. Now, he also talks about man being a machine. And this is a very big statement. Man is a machine. It's also frightful. We don't like to think of ourselves as being machines, right? But man is a machine is at the heart of realizing this is the heart of self-conception. You know, we naturally assume we possess free will. Remember, I mentioned earlier, we make all these conscious choices and act from consistent motives, but Gurdjieff challenged this assumption by directing our attention to how automatically we actually function. You know, we perform physical actions, walking, driving, typing, whatever, without really thinking about it. We experience predictable emotional responses to various emotional triggers. We see this now even with what's going on in the world. Our thoughts follow habitual pathways, like they're fixed tracks, and neurologically that happens to be so. And we also adopt recognizable roles and behaviors in specific contexts, and so this leads to the next concept of Gurdjieff is the I. Now, as I am, right? So he says that man has no individual I. Instead, he has hundreds and thousands of separate small I's, often entirely unknown to one another. And what he means by that is that because we react differently in different situations, that is a different I. That is essentially almost a different person, right? So this inner multiplicity of I's explains many of our own contradictions, right? We make a resolution at night and break it in the morning. That's happened to me. I would start the morning off. I'm going to do this, and that. And by the time afternoon comes, half of those things are forgotten. And that's a different I, Or an example of, we love someone deeply one moment and feel irritated by them in the next. Listen, if you've been in a relationship, you've seen this, you've experienced this, right? Where you have this love burst for them, but then they do this one thing that really, really irritates you. And that's a different I. Okay, and another example is we believe passionately in a particular idea, whatever that idea is, but then later wonder how we could have thought of such a thing in the first place. See, and this is really pertinent in today's world, right? We have people who either voted a certain way or believed a certain thing, and that was their I at the time, and then regretted it later. And that's a different I. So there's this multiplicity of I's. So I think that that's really very important. So, because each statement feels completely real, right? While we're in it, you're saying, this is who I really am, until the next state takes control. So it's really important to notice that. So in a sense, it's an inner fragmentation. So this explains why good intentions so rarely translate into consistent actions. I mean, almost all the time, right? The I that makes commitment is displaced by the other I that doesn't, that breaks it. So without an inner unity, we remain at the mercy of these changing circumstances. So although it's a natural process for us to have these different I's, it's not conducive to our inner well-being. And Gurdjieff said that sort of the way out of these mechanical behaviors is to begin with self-observation, watching yourself with impartial, non-judging attention. Now, to be clear, this isn't self-criticism, but sort of an observation, and I'll almost make it like scientific. So, for example, I notice that when praised, I automatically speak more and stand taller. I see how my attention drifts to food whenever I'm writing something challenging. I observe that certain words trigger a defensive reaction in me, right? So when you observe, those are just some examples, right? When you observe those things in that way, you start to bring the I's together. And the reason is because these mechanical behaviors, and we've all experienced this, are very powerful when we're not observing them, right? But when we bring consciousness to those automations, I guess you could say, we begin to loosen their grip, right? I mean, one of Gurdjieff's students said, I cannot change the fact that I am mechanical, but I can observe that I am mechanical. And in that observation, something else is present that is not mechanical. So with continued practice, this observation can lead to what Gurdjieff calls crystallization or integration, which is very important. So as you can see, just in this broad podcast, we've already covered so much, and very intense things, right? Because it is true. All of these things are true. We have all of these automations going on, and we don't always realize them. So I'm going to end this podcast now because it's all, it's like 25 minutes already. I do hope you enjoy it. In the next video, the next installment, I'm going to get a little bit more granular, and I'm going to talk about the law of three, the law of seven, and the Enneagram, in reference to Gurdjieffs' principles. I really think you're going to enjoy that one. I sort of wrote out a general outline for it already, and I'll probably even record it within the next 2 days and release it hopefully also within the next 2 days. Anyway, that's it for now. I hope you enjoy it. Thank you again for all your support, and I will speak to you soon. So mote it be.